At first glance, the residents of Avila Beach seem to be living the California dream, ideal for raising a family, away from traffic and urban blight. However, all is not what it appears to be. The Unocal Petroleum Company operated an active oil shipping and storage facility in the town for nearly a century. The oil pipelines beneath the beach and homes have been leaking for decades. Unlike the acute pesticide exposure that affected residents in Chicago, the subtle effects of chronic, multiple chemical exposures require a more complex investigation. Can human health problems be linked to these hazardous hydrocarbons?
The leakage is approximately over the area of Front Street and onto the beach and a little inward into the business section and community of Avila Beach. There's approximately about 400,000 gallons of oil materials that have leaked from these pipelines underground. You don't see it on the surface, but it's below the surface, out onto the beach and underneath the street and underneath some buildings.
In 1989, testing by the Regional Water Quality Control Board determined that this plume consisted of refined petrochemicals, 6% gasoline, 80% diesel, and 14% crude oil. The presence of these hazardous substances prompted a health risk assessment.
The health and ecological risk assessment was a study that essentially looked at what were the cleanup levels required for a cleanup activity. It did not look at health effects. So this really was an open question. Our initial evaluation was that volatile organic compounds, diesel, crude oil, gas, all underground should not be a significant health risk.
Petrochemicals such as benzene, toluene, and xylene can attack the fatty tissue of the brain and central nervous system. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, these chemicals may cause cancer, short-term memory loss, and possible psychological disorders.
Based on those chemicals and the fact that they were able to find them in samplings both in the sand and in the air, this posed a potential threat to health of the people who would utilize the beach. Because not only were they just walking on it, they were lying in the sand, some people were burying themselves in the sand, there were children who were being exposed, and children are far more susceptible to many of these things than are the adults. I thought it would be prudent to prohibit people from using the beach until they could make a determination of what actually is going on.
Health risk assessments are done primarily looking at a site characterization. We look at actual sand ingestion. We look at the air that people breathe. We look at the way that vapor might come up through the sand, either for people sitting on the beach or coming up underneath their houses and contaminating the air in their house.
Random samples taken by the County Health Department found PAH contaminant levels in the air and beach below the action levels set by state and federal EPA, levels based upon experimental models using animals and some worker exposure studies. However, it is not merely the levels of the individual chemicals, but their interaction that may either compound or mitigate the toxicological effects.
We funded 3 different tests, different risk assessments that were used. All these risk assessments basically showed that the risk was minimal, very insignificant to the community, even with long-term exposure, where somebody would actually physically have to immerse themselves in this material. There was minimal risk associated with the material underneath the ground.
Health effects were determined to be essentially, quote, non-significant. That is, a cancer risk was less than 1 in a million, and that a hazard index also indicated that we would not expect toxic effects to the population.
The company, Unical, had only spent money on examining the soil and the sand at the beach for chemicals, that not a single penny had been spent on a patient's complaint. No patient had been able to go anywhere to have any testing done.
Regardless of the county's test results, community members remained concerned about the potential impact to their health and the meaning of certain symptoms they may have been experiencing.
You know, I've seen people with a high incidence of cancer here, but I don't know if it's more than another area. I've seen my own wife's whose health doesn't seem to be that well, but you know, without a toxologist and without all those kind of tests, we'll never know.
So if you were to give me a list of what bothers you now, what would be on that list?
Basically, it's just the migraine headaches.
Mm-hmm. The important thing is to address symptoms as they occur now and compare that with symptoms that a patient might have had years ago or before a given incident, such as exposure, such as moving into the area where there might have been exposure. So a symptom list is very important. So you have no problems with the way your mind works, your brain works?
Yes, I do. Lately, in the last few years, my memory has been really, really bad.
Some people will exaggerate their complaints, and some people, like, for instance, the lady we had here, possibly understated her complaints, because she started out just saying she had headaches. And it took a while to figure out that really there was more to it, that she has a memory problem and has made notes to herself for the last 2 years. She didn't even mention that in the beginning. So she understates her problems and other people exaggerate, which is why you need objective tests.
Part of the health risk assessment included a hazard index, and that's not a cancer-causing index. That's looking at the levels that are known to potentially cause health effects and comparing them to the levels found. And part of the health risk assessment determined that the levels were so low that you could not ascribe any specific health effects to the exposure levels.
In fact, one of the tests was actually conducted by the agencies to determine if there was a risk to the population in Avila Beach. The results from all of that testing showed that the risks were very minimal, insignificant in terms to the public or the users of that beach. The community is safe, has been safe for the time that the contamination has existed at Avila Beach. The risks are very minimal. One would have to be exposed for a long period of time to the materials underground, and even that risk would not pose them a significant health concern.
The community are having health effects. Visitors to the beach complain of rashes, asthma attacks. Some have even developed chemically induced pneumonia.
The response team for the chemically injured, a non-profit health organization, began a grassroots campaign to develop a database of symptoms from the community and determine if there was a similar pattern of illness among the residents.
We used our own funding and we did a door-to-door survey, and we found that there are some significant health problems here and that it should be looked into further.
In a community such as Avila, who has known for years about the chemicals being there, even at the first meeting, you may have a person standing up over here saying, boy, we're glad somebody's finally doing something, and you have a person over here saying, why are you creating all this havoc and publicity and scaring? I mean, you've got that right from the get-go.